And now a reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 12 through 20.
Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Even so, the body is not made up of one part, but of many. Now, if a foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, it would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body.
A few months ago, I shared sort of a controversial sentiment with you all. I told you shortly after meeting me that I didn't like church. Obviously, this set off warning bells in a lot of people, and I needed to backtrack quite a bit to explain myself. That's my bad. You see, I tried to give you a sermon's message in a single quippable line. Well, today I'm going to give you the full sermon. Our reading this morning comes from the Apostle Paul, who was writing to a church in Corinth. And the church in Corinth was struggling with a sense of identity, like a lot of the very first Christian churches. They wondered, who are we? What are we doing? Why do we exist? But a big part of this identity crisis had to do with the talent of speaking in tongues. Have you ever been to a church where people do this? If you haven't, it's quite an experience. It can be uncomfortable as a spectator. When a person speaks in tongues, they speak with this sort of gibberish, nonsensical, non-language. It's not words, it's just sounds and utterances that almost resemble words. But it's an ecstatic and meaningful religious and spiritual experience for these people that help them to connect with God. I don't like it. I tried to do this and it didn't work for me. And I don't mean to diminish anyone else's spiritual experiences, but when I speak in tongues, I had the opposite effect as those who did it and did like it. I felt self-conscious, I felt silly, and I felt kind of cynical about the whole thing. For a long time, I thought that my inability to speak in tongues meaningfully was a representation of my spiritual immaturity. But in Paul's Corinthian church, he encounters people a lot like me. Many of the Corinthians had the gift in speaking with tongue, which filled them with the Spirit and lifted their souls up to God. But many others did not. What did that mean? Did that mean that they were rejected by God? Did that mean that the Holy Spirit left them out of the full experience? Imagine sitting on the sidelines while your friends speak in tongues and sing and dance and have this meaningful experience, and you're just watching, not getting it. Paul rushes to address this, and he reminds this community that he doesn't expect strict assimilation. We all have gifts, and diversity is a good thing, not a bad thing. To illustrate in his letter, he uses the metaphor of the human body. We are like hands and feet and eyes and ears, all useful and all different. A hand can't do what a foot can do, which cannot do what an eye can do, which cannot do what ears do. Paul reminds us that individually and on their own, they are basically useless. If our bodies were all eyes, how could we hear? If our bodies were all ears, how could we see? It's our diversity that makes us rich. Some cannot speak in tongues, and that's okay. You're just a hand. instead of an ear. We need those too. Worship service was my speaking in tongues growing up. I saw that some people really enjoyed it, but it never resonated with me in any meaningful way. It was never an experience I enjoyed, just one that I endured. It was never something that engaging in made me lose track of time, just something that I memorized the order of so that I could see when the end was coming, which was always the best part. For many who attend church religiously, pun intended, and receive spiritual satisfaction from it, this might sound like heresy. After all, it's my responsibility to conform to God, not God's responsibility to conform to me. But Christ demonstrates to us repeatedly that that's not really the case. Christ washes the feet of his disciples. He breaks the bread for the masses and heals and forgives those condemned to suffering and death. Christ is not towering above us. Christ is holding our hand beside us. Over and over, God demonstrates through Christ the relationship that God wishes to have with all of us, one that is legitimate and sincere, and above all, mutual. In 2014, I first experienced this kind of spirituality, one that met me where I was, one that resonated with my soul. Rachel, my wife, and I were attending our first Disciples Church together, and we joined the young adult Sunday school class, which was led less by a strict curriculum and more fueled by interesting discussions that were critical and honest. Around that table, myself and 8 other young adults debated, joked, asked questions, and learned from one another. And I gotta tell you, there was an electricity in my soul that day, some kind of like awakening. It was an ecstatic feeling that I could be welcome to ask questions and challenge common thinking, that my voice could be so important that other people would listen to it, and there was so much more that I could learn about God other than what I had been shown. I got more fulfillment in 1 hour of that class than I had gotten from 24 years of regularly attending church. For those of you who are like me, you are not alone. It's not just you. You are not crazy. Worship can be a drag if it's not your thing. And it's okay to admit that. There are other ways to come to God and other ways to be a church. For those of you who are not like me, this sermon is not an indictment of traditional worship. Far from it. This reverent, joyful experience resonates with your soul, and for that reason, it should be protected, not replaced with the newest, shiniest thing. But because you find yourself in this place of privilege, naturally fulfilled in the spirit by the structures which already exist, you are better equipped to aid your brothers and sisters in finding theirs. So then we're faced with another set of questions. What else can a church look like? What can church specifically not look like? What even is church? Lately, I've been confronting a lot of these foundational questions. Why do we do what we do? What are the rules here? How far is too far? How much can we leave behind on our search for spiritual fulfillment without leaving Christ behind in the process? To tackle this question, I consulted a book, and it's called Pagan Christianity, with a question mark in it, by Frank Viola and George Barna. And this book examines nearly every contemporary Christian tradition critically and compares it to the first New Testament churches. This book is not meant to dismantle the contemporary church, but to remind us that Christianity is adaptable and flexible. The stereotypical church experience does not need to be the only church experience. The authors describe the ancient church of more of a community dinner and theological discussion. There might be an experienced, educated faith leader to moderate that discussion, but generally the encounter was decentralized from authority. Sermons were just prompts for questions. Communion was bread and wine, and the rest of dinner too. Music was spontaneous and ecstatic and subversive. But more than all of that, a church was a people and not a place. It was called ecclesia, and it was something that you were, not something that you went to. Let's consider what these authors say in the book. In the minds of the early Christians, the people, not the architecture, constituted a sacred space. The early Christians understood that they themselves, corporately, were the temple of God and the house of God. Now let's consider what Jesus says about this kind of topic from the Gospel of Matthew. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am with them. The church is our community, together, expressing our commitment and relationship to God by means which is good. Notice the emphasis on that last word, good. So what is good? Plenty of people practice church, gathering under God's name in ways that are bad. Think of what we talked about last week, stuff like that. Church which discriminates and tears down people because they haven't conformed is bad. Church which lifts others up and values their spiritual gifts, regardless of how different or non-traditional they may be, is good. Church which is life-giving is good. Church which is life-taking is bad. Church which demonstrates God's love in the world is good. Church which misaligns itself from God's goals and only serves to be a club in and of itself is very bad. The possibilities for church are endless. Some people engage in church over coffee and cakes as they meet with Christ in that way. Others do so at AA meetings where they seek to come to Christ and recover. Some have intimate, tear-jerking, hard church with a trusted loved one or a friend. And church can also look at like a beautiful, relevant, and reverent worship experience where we gather together and sing and celebrate God's name. What kind of church do you want to be? How do you like worship when you're away from the building? Think about it. And when the pandemic has ended and we finally reunite in person, let's be creative about it. We all have our unique and important gifts and differences. Let's celebrate that.